Your brother will take over the marketing department starting Monday, my father announced, not meeting my eyes across the dinner table. A familiar coldness spread through my chest as I set down my fork. The marketing strategy I'd spent months developing, the one that had increased our profits by 22% last quarter, suddenly felt like a weight in my stomach. Dad, I've been running marketing for 3 years. We just had our best quarter yet. My voice was steady, betraying nothing of the trembling in my hands. He took a casual sip of his wine. Alex has some fresh ideas, and he just finished his MBA. It's time we utilized his expertise. Alex, my younger brother, had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not enough to decline the opportunity. He'd been working part-time at Harrington Family Foods for all of 6 months, while I had dedicated 7 years of my life to the business my grandfather started. Those fresh ideas Alex pitched last week, those were mine from the proposal you dismissed in January. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Emma, don't be dramatic. Your brother needs a chance to prove himself too. It was the same conversation we'd had countless times, just with different departments, different ideas, different dismissals. I was 31 years old, and I'd spent nearly a decade watching my contributions disappear into the void. Or worse, reappear with my brother's name attached. I looked at my family around the table. Dad, focused on cutting his steak into precise pieces. Mom, already moving on to discussing some charity gala. Alex, a mixture of guilt and triumph flickering across his face. Something shifted inside me, like a gear finally clicking into place after years of misalignment. I quit, I said quietly. The room froze. My father's knife stopped mid-cut, suspended above his plate. My mother's endless stream of chatter about table settings and guest lists abruptly ceased. Even the soft classical music playing in the background seemed to hold its breath. You what? My father's voice was low, dangerous. I quit, I repeated, louder this time. I'm done. Alex leaned forward. Emma, come on. You're overreacting. Am I? I pushed back my chair and stood. Let's review. Last year, my distribution model was impractical until Alex suggested it 3 months later. My supplier relationship strategy was too aggressive until Alex presented the exact same approach as bold and innovative. The Anderson account that I cultivated for 2 years, reassigned to Alex the moment it was ready to sign. My father's face hardened into the expression I'd seen directed at difficult suppliers and underperforming employees, but never at family. Never at Alex. You're being childish. This is business, not a playground competition. Exactly, I replied, surprisingly calm despite the thundering of my heart. It's business, and in business, results matter, skills matter, contribution matters, or at least it should. My mother reached for my arm. Sweetheart, sit down. Let's discuss this rationally. I gently removed her hand. I've tried rational discussion for 7 years, Mom. I've presented data, made cases, proven my value over and over. What would you suggest I try next? The silence stretched between us, filled with decades of unspoken expectations and assumptions. My father saw himself in Alex, the son who would carry on the Harrington name and legacy. My mother saw family harmony as the ultimate goal, even when that harmony was built on my silence. And Alex? Alex saw opportunity and took it, because that's what he'd been raised to do. 2 weeks' notice, my father finally said, his voice clipped. Proper documentation of all your projects. A transition plan for your responsibilities. Richard? My mother gasped, but I nodded. Of course. I'll have everything on your desk tomorrow. As I walked out of the dining room, leaving my half-eaten dinner behind, I felt a strange lightness. For years, I'd tried to prove my worth through dedication and results, believing that eventually the evidence would speak for itself. Now I understood. No amount of evidence matters when someone has already decided not to see it. The fluorescent lights of my office buzzed as I packed the last of my personal items into a cardboard box. Family photos, business books, the small jade plant that had somehow survived 3 years on my windowsill. 7 years reduced to a single box. A knock at the door made me look up. Alex stood in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets. You don't have to do this, Em. I continued packing. Yes, I do. Dad's just old-fashioned. He doesn't mean to. To what? I asked, finally meeting his eyes. To consistently ignore my ideas until you present them as your own? To undermine every achievement I've ever had in this company? To make me feel like I'm going crazy when I point it out? Alex had the decency to flush. It's not like that. He has certain ideas about how things should be. And those ideas don't include giving his daughter credit for her work. I closed the box and taped it shut with more force than necessary. Tell me something, Alex. That distribution model you developed last year, the one that cut our logistics costs by 30 cents, did Dad ever mention that I created that model? That I showed it to him 3 separate times and he rejected it every time? The silence was answer enough. You're talented, Alex, but so am I. And I'm done being the ghost employee of Harrington Family Foods. He shifted uncomfortably. Where will you go? It was a good question. I'd spent my entire adult life at Harrington, moving from department to department, learning every aspect of the business. My resume was impressive, if anyone bothered to verify which accomplishments were actually mine. I don't know yet, I admitted, but anywhere would be better than staying where I'm invisible. Alex's eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt. I never asked for him to treat us differently. No, I agreed, picking up my box. But you never refused the advantages either. As I walked past him, he reached out as if to stop me, then let his hand fall. This will kill Dad, you know. The business is everything to him. I paused at the door. The business was everything to me too, Alex. The difference is, Dad never saw that. As I walked out of the office that day, carrying my single box of belongings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. The weight of unacknowledged work and dismissed ideas had become so familiar that its absence left me feeling almost dizzy with lightness. The first month after leaving was harder than I'd anticipated. I'd built my identity around Harrington Family Foods for so long that without it, I felt adrift. My apartment, a place I'd previously used mainly for sleeping and weekend laundry, suddenly seemed too empty, too quiet. The days stretched before me, unstructured and uncertain. I avoided my parents' calls, made excuses to miss Sunday dinners, and threw myself into job applications. But each interview followed a similar pattern. Initial interest in my experience, followed by uncomfortable questions when they realized I couldn't provide specific examples of my accomplishments without mentioning they'd been attributed to someone else. So you're saying you developed these strategies, but they were implemented under your brother's name? One interviewer asked, skepticism evident in her voice. Yes, I said simply, knowing how it sounded. And you have no documentation to support this claim? I didn't. My father had been meticulous about keeping official credit where he believed it belonged, with Alex. My name appeared on internal memos and drafts, but never on final implementations or public-facing materials. By the 4th week, my savings were dwindling, and my confidence along with them. Had I made a terrible mistake? Was I truly as valuable as I believed, or had I been deluding myself all along? The text from Diane Chen, a former supplier for Harrington, came unexpectedly one rainy afternoon. Heard you left the family business. Interested in consulting for us? Your distribution model would work perfectly for our West Coast expansion. It was the validation I'd been craving. Recognition from someone who had seen my work firsthand and recognized its value, regardless of whose name was attached to it. Our meeting the next day was eye-opening. Diane laid out exactly what she needed, the timeline, and most surprisingly, the compensation, nearly double what I'd been making at Harrington. This seems high, I said cautiously, looking at the figure. Diane shrugged. It's market rate for someone with your expertise. Frankly, you've been underpaid for years. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just recognition my father had withheld. It was fair compensation as well. The family business justification had masked what would have been unacceptable treatment in any other company. By the end of the 2nd month, I had 3 consulting clients, all competitors or adjacent businesses to Harrington. Companies that valued my expertise enough to pay premium rates for it. Companies where I didn't have to fight to be heard. Every Sunday dinner became an exercise in restraint, as my parents carefully avoided mentioning the business, while Alex grew increasingly stressed around the edges. How's the job search going? My mother asked pointedly one evening, passing the potatoes with just a touch too much force. It's not, I replied simply. I'm consulting. Already have 3 clients. The silence that followed was deafening. My father cleared his throat. Consulting? That's not stable, Emma. You know you always have a place at the company. The place he was offering was the same one I'd always had: invisible, unacknowledged, convenient. I smiled and changed the subject. What I didn't tell them was that two of my consulting clients were direct competitors of Harrington Family Foods, companies that valued my expertise enough to pay premium rates for it, companies where my ideas weren't dismissed because of my gender or family position, but evaluated on their merits. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years fighting to be seen within my family business, only to find immediate recognition outside it. Each successful project with my new clients rebuilt a piece of the confidence that had been systematically dismantled at Harrington. But with that growing confidence came a new discomfort. The more distance I gained from the family business, the more clearly I could see the dysfunctional patterns that had shaped not just my professional life, but my personal relationships as well. You always defer to your brother's preferences. My new friend Melissa pointed out one night over drinks. Even for simple things, like where to eat dinner. I hadn't noticed, but she was right. Years of having my opinions dismissed had trained me to stop offering them at all. And you apologize constantly, she continued, for things that aren't remotely your fault. That observation hit harder. How many times had I apologized to my father for causing tension when I'd questioned why my ideas were being dismissed? How often had I taken responsibility for misunderstandings that were actually clear instances of my work being appropriated? These realizations were uncomfortable, painful even. But like stretching a muscle that had been cramped for too long, the pain came with a sense of necessary release. By the third month, the whispers started. Sales at Harrington had dipped. Their new product launch, one I would have overseen, had faltered. Distribution issues were cropping up with increasing frequency. "Your father's worried sick," my mother said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "The business is struggling. This would never have happened if..." If what, Mom? If I'd stayed? If I'd continued to be the workhorse without recognition? Her silence spoke volumes. I offered my ideas for years. Dad chose not to listen. That's not on me. But despite my words, guilt gnawed at me. The business had been my grandfather's legacy, had put me through college, had been my entire world. Was I betraying my family by walking away? That night, I pulled out the small photo I kept on my nightstand. Me at 7, sitting on my grandfather's lap in his office. His large hand covered mine as we pretended to review company reports together. "You've got a good head for business, Emmy," he'd told me. "Just like your old grandpa." He died when I was 15, before I was old enough to join the company, before my father fully took over and subtly shifted the expectations. Would my grandfather have seen me differently? Would he have valued my contributions in a way my father couldn't or wouldn't? The question haunted me, mixing with the guilt and the growing sense of conflicted loyalty. The business was struggling without me, a vindication of my value, but also a shadow over my grandfather's legacy. 6 months after my departure, the text message came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. "We need to talk. Family meeting tonight." Non-negotiable. Dad, I considered ignoring it. My consulting business was thriving. I just signed a major contract with West Coast Foods, implementing the very distribution strategy my father had dismissed. I was finally being recognized for my abilities, compensated fairly, treated with respect. But family ties aren't so easily severed. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the dismissal and the years of invisibility, they were still my family. And Harrington Foods was still the business my grandfather had built from nothing, the legacy he'd entrusted to us. I texted back a simple, "I'll be there," and spent the next hour staring at the rain-streaked window of my office, wondering what exactly I was walking into. The Harrington family dining room had always been the site of major announcements, arguments, and reconciliations. Tonight, it felt smaller somehow. The cherry wood table that had seemed so imposing throughout my childhood, now just furniture, worn at the edges from decades of family dinners. My father looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture less commanding. Alex's typical confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that had him constantly fidgeting with his water glass. "The company's in trouble," my father announced without preamble once we were all seated. "We've lost market share, The Westfield account is threatening to pull out, and distribution is a mess. My mother reached for his hand. Richard, just tell her. He took a deep breath. We need you back, Emma. The validation I'd craved for years should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt hollow. Why? I asked simply. Because the company is failing without you, Alex blurted out. Everything I've tried to implement has backfired. The strategies Dad approved aren't working. We're hemorrhaging money. So I'm the life raft, I stated flatly. Not valuable enough to acknowledge when things were going well, but necessary when the ship is sinking. That's not fair, my father protested, but the argument sounded weak even to his ears. What's not fair, I countered, is spending 7 years being undermined and ignored, watching my ideas be attributed to someone else, and then being expected to run back when you finally realize my value. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that had punctuated every significant moment of my childhood. I was wrong, my father finally said, the words seeming physically painful for him to pronounce. I didn't. I couldn't see past certain expectations, and the company, your grandfather's legacy, is suffering for it. It's not just about the company, Dad. I looked around at each of them. It's about family. It's about trust and respect. What do you want? He asked, a hint of his old negotiator's instinct surfacing. Partnership? Higher salary? Your name on the letterhead? I shook my head slowly. I want acknowledgement of what happened. I want a genuine apology, not just because you need me now, but because what happened was wrong, and I want a contract that explicitly outlines my role, authority, and credit for my work. My mother gasped softly. You would make us sign a contract? We're family. Yes, I replied, we are family, and that should have protected me from what happened, not facilitated it. The words hung in the air between us, disrupting years of carefully maintained family mythology. We had always been the perfect Harringtons, successful in business, united in purpose, traditional in values. My demand for formal recognition cracked that facade, exposing the rot beneath. I can't just publicly admit I was wrong, my father said, his voice strained. The board, the employees, it would undermine confidence in leadership. Then maybe leadership should have thought of that before appropriating my work for years, I replied, surprised at my own firmness. 6 months ago, I would have backed down, accepted whatever scraps of acknowledgement were offered. Now, with the perspective of distance and the confidence of external validation, I could see clearly what I deserved. Alex, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. She's right, Dad. His eyes met mine across the table. Emma's ideas were better than mine. Her strategies worked. Everyone in the company knows it. They just couldn't say it. My father's face flushed. You too, Alex? After everything I've done to position you as the next leader? That's the problem, Alex interrupted. You were so focused on making me the heir apparent that you ignored the fact that Emma is better at this than I am, and now we're all paying for it. It was the first time my brother had ever publicly acknowledged the imbalance between us, the first time he'd chosen truth over advantage. Something small and wounded inside me began to heal at his words. The negotiation took weeks. There were tears, shouting matches, and moments of bitter recognition on both sides. My father, confronted with evidence of years of dismissal and appropriation, vacillated between defensive anger and genuine remorse. My mother struggled to reconcile her role as peacekeeper with the realization that she had enabled an unfair dynamic. Alex, to his credit, openly acknowledged his complicity. I knew it was wrong, he admitted during one particularly raw conversation, but it was easier to accept the credit than to challenge Dad. And easier to let me fight all the battles alone, I added. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, Em. Really sorry. Those simple words, acknowledgement of the wrong, acceptance of responsibility, were the beginning of a new relationship between us. Not the idealized sibling harmony our mother had always pushed for, but something more honest, more balanced, and ultimately more sustainable. The day I returned to Harrington Family Foods was nothing like my departure. Instead of a quiet exit with a single box, I walked in as the newly appointed Chief Innovation Officer with a contract that specifically credited me for past contributions and outlined clear parameters for future acknowledgement. My father introduced me to the staff with a speech that clearly cost him considerable pride, but which he delivered without qualification. Many of the innovations you've seen implemented over the past years, the distribution model, the marketing strategy, the Westfield account acquisition, these were Emma's work. We failed to properly acknowledge that, and the company has suffered in her absence. That changes today. The restoration wasn't instantaneous. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal cleanly. There were still moments of tension, instances where old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But now, when my ideas were questioned or dismissed, I had both the contractual authority and the personal confidence to stand my ground. More importantly, I had allies I hadn't recognized before, employees who had seen my contributions all along and were relieved to finally be able to acknowledge them openly. Sarah from accounting, who quietly provided me with documentation of how my strategies had impacted profits. Marcus from operations, who had kept records of every improvement I'd suggested. Even Janine, my father's longtime assistant, who had witnessed years of my ideas being repackaged for Alex's presentations. We always knew, Janine told me quietly one afternoon. We just couldn't say anything. Those words were both healing and painful, confirmation that I hadn't been crazy, that others had seen what was happening, but also a reminder of the power dynamics that had silenced not just me, but everyone around me. And somewhere in the midst of rebuilding the company, I began to rebuild myself as well. The Emma who had left Harrington in a single-box exit had been angry, hurt, and desperate for validation. The Emma who returned was still wounded, but stronger, aware of her value, clear about her boundaries, and unwilling to accept less than she deserved. 1 year after my return, Harrington Family Foods hosted its annual company picnic. As employees and their families gathered in the summer sunshine, I found myself standing beside my father at the grill, an echo of countless summer barbecues from my childhood. The Robinson contract came through, he said, flipping a burger with practiced precision. Your approach worked. I know, I replied without arrogance, just acknowledgement of fact. He was quiet for a moment, his attention seemingly focused on the grill. I've been thinking about your grandfather lately, he finally said, about what he would think of all this. I waited, letting him find his way to whatever he needed to say. He would have seen your value from the beginning, my father admitted. He was better at that than I was, seeing people for their abilities, not their categories. Categories, I repeated. You mean seeing me as a daughter rather than a business asset? Both, actually. He turned to look at me directly. I failed to see you as either properly. I didn't respect your business acumen, and I didn't protect you as a father should. I was so focused on legacy, on continuing things as they'd always been, that I couldn't see I was undermining the very legacy I wanted to preserve. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. And in that moment, standing beside my father, as he struggled to reconcile his past behavior with his current understanding, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but a willingness to build something new from the rubble of what had been broken. We're different, Dad, I said finally. We always will be, but different doesn't have to mean at odds. Across the lawn, I could see Alex engaged in animated conversation with our marketing team. He'd found his own place in the company, once freed from the expectations my father had placed on him, not as my replacement, but as his own person with unique strengths. My mother approached, carrying a tray of sliced watermelon. Emma, the Westfield representatives were asking for you. Something about expanding their contract? I'll talk to them, I said, surprised at the lack of tension in the exchange. It had taken months of difficult conversations for my mother to recognize her role in enabling the family dynamic, and even longer for her to stop trying to smooth over legitimate conflicts with platitudes about family harmony. As I walked across the lawn toward the Westfield contingent, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window, shoulders back, head high, moving with a confidence that came not from external validation, but from hard-won self-knowledge. The journey hadn't been clean or simple. There had been moments of doubt, painful confrontations, and the uncomfortable recognition that healing doesn't erase the scars of old wounds. But standing here, fully acknowledged and valued for my contributions, I understood something fundamental. The restoration of justice wasn't just about receiving credit for my work. It was about creating space for authentic relationships built on respect, rather than obligation. I had needed to leave to understand my own value. My family had needed my absence to recognize what they had taken for granted. And while the pain of those years couldn't be undone, it had been transformed into something else, a foundation for something stronger, more honest, and ultimately more sustaining than what had existed before. The business was thriving now, not despite the upheaval, but because of it. Because authenticity and acknowledgement, it turned out, weren't just personally healing. They were good business. Innovation couldn't flourish in the shadows of dismissal and appropriation. It needed light, recognition, and the freedom to fail and try again. As I greeted the Westfield representatives with confident handshakes and direct eye contact, I thought about the email waiting in my drafts folder. A business plan for a side venture, something entirely my own. Not an escape this time, but an expansion. Because I had learned that my value wasn't defined by a single context or relationship. It existed independently, whether recognized or not. But how much more powerful it was when that value was seen, acknowledged, and allowed to flourish in the light.